From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. In Today, K-State's Jeff Whitworth to talk about a trio of insect pests that are making their presence known right now in wheat and alfalfa stands, namely army cutworms, winter grain mites, and Hessian fly larvae. He'll talk about the signs of these potentially damaging those crops heading into early spring and whether they're likely to require treatment. Then K-State's Mike Stamm will provide an update on the condition of the canola crop here in the Central Plains and if there's been any sort of widespread winterkill. He'll talk about the indications of that to look for. And on this week's horticulture segment, K-State's Ward Upham will offer guidance on pruning fruit trees. All that coming right up on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to the K-State Radio Network and Agriculture Today. Good to have you joining us once more. We're not quite to springtime yet, but there's reason in talking about various insect pests that may be starting to well up out there, particularly with our warmer weather of late. We've asked Jeff Whitworth to come back by, crop entomologist with K-State Research and Extension. He has been, in fact, inspecting fields out there of wheat in particular, seeing what's going on, and we'll talk about that. But Jeff, you also are getting calls from various folks about annoying insects that are showing up as well.
Yes, and thank you very much for having me.
Sure.
I've gotten several calls in the last, 2 or 3 weeks. You know, as we go through the winter, we generally have roller coaster periods of warm, cool, cold. And usually every time it warms up a little bit, I get a call or two about nuisance pests that are inside a barn or a building or a house or something. And a lot of times those are the multicolored Asian lady beetle or just one of the lady beetles for most folks. These and other insects, they can be flies. There's a lot of what we call attic flies that overwinter as adults. There's also some stink bugs that can overwinter in mass numbers in certain places. But these insects are overwintering as adults. And so anytime it warms up a little bit, wherever they are, they can become active. In the case of the lady beetles, they can actually bite. In the case of flies, sometimes some of the flies can actually bite, but generally it's just a case that they're present and they can be flying around windows, trying to get to the outside or trying to get around doors or whatever, and they're just a pest. The main question I get is, what should I use to spray these things with? Generally, we don't recommend treating with an insecticide for these. For the most part, they're adults. They're only there for overwintering purposes. They won't stay there. What we generally recommend is you just get the vacuum sweeper out, vacuum up the ones as they die, or even if they're flying around, take it out and dump it outside, and they'll go away, okay? They're really not what we consider a pest, so most of them don't even have a label, on a pesticide labeled for their control. When it gets cold again, they'll become inactive, and you won't even know they're there again until spring.
Well, enough on those nuisance pests, although they're not really pests, as you say. To the field, then, as you've been, Jeff, recently, checking out wheat stands to see what might be happening in an early sense in as far as insect activity or signs of potential activity.
Yes. As most of you remember, last late summer into the fall, we had a pretty good outbreak of armyworms and fall armyworms. They were into the brome. They were into the alfalfa. They did a pretty good number on volunteer wheat. We were kind of happy about that. But one of the questions I've been getting in the last 2 or 3 weeks, as it does start to warm up and folks are starting to look forward to maybe spring in the wheat and the alfalfa breaking dormancy, will these fall armyworms and armyworms continue into the spring and cause problems? Now, remember, these pests are pests in the spring. The fall armyworm, we don't think overwinters in Kansas. Armyworms might, but probably not. So once the fall gets here, once that infestation's over with, they're probably not going to be around in the spring. Now, maybe late spring when they come back from wherever they overwintered in the southern part of the United States or Mexico or wherever, but they're probably not going to be a problem early on. However, last fall we did have army cutworms, and army cutworms, if you recall, in 2020 weren't too bad, but in 2018, 2019, they caused a lot of problems in alfalfa and wheat. The army cutworm is different from the armyworm or the fall armyworm. The army cutworm moth lays eggs in the fall, late summer, early fall. Those eggs hatch then, and the little small larvae are what are out there. There were several locations in the central part of the state last fall that they noticed birds feeding. And they went out and looked, and there were little small larvae. They thought they were armyworms, but actually they're army cutworms. So it makes a big difference. The army cutworm will overwinter as the larva, as a worm. So they're out there feeding. Anytime the temperature gets above 55 degrees, they will feed a little bit on wheat and alfalfa. But it really doesn't matter because the crops are dormant. But as the temperatures warm up, when these crops break dormancy, that's when you can start noticing the army cutworm feeding. So if you had army cutworms there last year, they're still going to be there going into the spring. Another one of the early season pests we worry about, especially in wheat, is the wintergrain mite, especially under dry conditions. As we go into the spring, if we don't get some adequate moisture, we could have some problems just because of that. But then if you have army cutworms feeding on that struggling wheat, alfalfa, and if you have wintergrain mites start to feed on the struggling wheat, then you can have problems. Wintergrain mites are called winter grain mites because they're most active in cold weather. They were active up until about the first part of December. Then they're inactive in their eggs, and then probably late February, early March, again, depending upon the weather, they will become active. They're very small. They're characteristic dark colored with red legs. They will feed generally at night, but sometimes they'll feed during the day if it's a cloudy day. They like cool weather, so anytime the weather's 50 degrees to about 30 degrees, that's when they're feeding. When it warms up, they're not feeding. Generally, if we have good growing conditions, the wheat has no problem outgrowing a hefty wintergrain mite infestation. But if it's struggling anyway for moisture and you have wintergrain mites actually sucking the juice out of each cell, that can really add to the stress of the wheat plant. As you're walking around or driving around, the wheat that is infested with wintergrain mites starts to look silvery, kind of brown on the ends and then silvery as the juice is sucked out of each individual cell. It just leaves the white, brown, tan, whatever color you want to call it, cell. So eventually that starts looking, silvery as you look across the field. If we get rain, we really don't recommend treating. Okay, if we don't get any rain and the wheat doesn't start growing out of it, that's when you have a decision to make whether to treat. I generally don't recommend treating for wintergrain mites because usually in all the years that I've been around, we will get a rain in some form or fashion within 7 to 10 days. That will really help. But if the wheat starts to break dormancy or trying to break dormancy and you got army cutworms feeding on it, and then you have wintergrain mites feeding on it, that could be a really tough go for the wheat, especially if we have, like I said, drought stress conditions.
But by no means a need for any preemptive strike against either of those.
No, there's absolutely nothing you can do right now. And this is when the wheat's in dormancy or the alfalfa or whatever, they're just not going to cause a problem. Okay, it's just once the crop breaks dormancy, starts to regrow and starts to tiller, that's when you need to get out and start looking. One of the first best indicators of army cutworms is birds out feeding in your fields. The birds will really help indicate that there's an army cutworm problem. It won't be fall armyworms. Fall armyworms usually don't come back in Kansas until mid-July. If you have feeding early on, it's army cutworms, and they were there as a result of the moth flying around last fall depositing eggs.
And one other item you say might be worth keeping on the radar, signs of Hessian fly damage?
Yes. I was looking, as you indicated, in fields this week. The weather was nice. It's nice just to get out, for one thing. We are a little premature, but I'm kind of like everybody else. You kind of get cabin fever. And we were looking at Hessian fly-infested wheat that the growers knew, or the consultants knew, was Hessian fly-infested last fall. It is kind of tough right now also, while the wheat's in dormancy, to determine what is, i.e., winter killing the wheat. But if you go out and you suspect winter grain mites, if you suspect army cutworms, or if you suspect Hessian fly, just dig a little bit of it up. What I do is just take a box, dig a little bit up in several places in the field, come back, shake it out, and if it's Hessian fly you're looking for, you got to strip out the tillers, and they're in the flaxseed stage right now. That's a little mahogany shaped like a seed, and they'll be stacked in, under a leaf or behind the leaf sheath, right around the base of the plant. The problem is, if you pull the plant up, a lot of them fall out, and they can still be in the soil. Then you're not going to find them, and they're still going to emerge in the spring. That doesn't seem to kill them. Might kill a few, but just shaking them out into the soil, into the roots, that doesn't seem to bother them. So it's really easy to overlook them. So what I'm recommending right now is just wait till we get green up, as they say, or the plants start breaking dormancy. Check it out, see if there's any place in the field that seems to be going backwards, as the growers like to say, or it's not keeping up with the rest of the field. That's the time to go out and look at that area and try and determine what the problem is.
That's a good heads up, as we are ever steadily now moving toward longer days, warmer days, and the end of the overwintering period for wheat and alfalfa, and as they exit dormancy relatively soon here. And Jeff, we will have you back as we move along and see what's happening crop insect-wise from time to time. Appreciate it.
My pleasure, and a little moisture would help.
Wouldn't hurt a thing. Jeff Whitworth, crop entomologist, K-State Research and Extension, with us on this segment of Agriculture Today. Agriculture Today continues now, and a briefing on the state of winter canola in Kansas. There have been conditions that have raised a few questions about whether that crop has withstood our winter weather in its various forms to date. With us now is canola agronomist with K-State Research and Extension, Mike Stamm. He just put out an article on this exact topic in the recent Agronomy e-Update newsletter. Canola has a history, if you will, of struggling with winter conditions, and that's always been discussed. But Mike, at the outset here, might bring up that work has been done to alleviate that, or at least address it, in the breeding programs in recent years successfully, has it not?
Yeah, Eric, that's right. We've made tremendous strides with improving winter survivability in canola through the breeding work that we've done, and it's basically just been a big selection program over the years where you select the best and you move forward with those, and that builds up your base within your program. And then when you bring new traits in, you cross to material that has that winter survivability. So I think we've taken some of the concern away, but there always is, it's still a new crop to the area. Mm-hmm. And so you always have questions this time of year about, well, how's it doing? The crop changed colors on me now. It looks like it's, been through the winter. What's going on out there?
Yeah. And we want to touch upon all of that, but take us back to last fall and planting time and the establishment of the canola crop in Kansas and this Central Plains region.
Last fall was kind of a struggle for the crop because in many places the planting zone moisture had dried out, and so some producers went in ahead and just seeded right into dust, basically, and then you kind of cross your fingers and hope for a rain, and that's we've talked about that before. That's not really something you want to do with canola because that top growth is so important to getting through the winter. Well, we were fortunate in that October was pretty wet for most of the state, and then we also had above normal temperatures, and so those two coupled together allowed the canola to really catch up. And so for the most part, what I saw across the state was the canola was in excellent shape going into the winter months. We had achieved that optimum top growth that we talk about, anywhere from 6 to 18 inches of above ground biomass. And in some instances here, like in Manhattan, we actually had a little bit too much top growth, and that can be a problem as well.
Let's spend a moment on that very thing. Fall stem elongation is the term that's used here, and that can be adversarial to canola if it goes too far.
Yeah, that's right. And there are a number of things that kind of bring this along. One is there is a genetic component where some varieties are more prone to fall stem elongation than others. And so in the breeding program, we've really tried to select against that. And so actually the conditions that we've had so far this year give us an excellent opportunity to select against fall stem elongation. So I'm actually a little bit excited about that. We'll be able to throw the material away that we know is prone to this phenomenon. So we're selecting against it in our breeding program, but then also we've learned management factors that allow us to avoid some of that as well, because if you plant too early, the crop can get too big, and you have too much competition among those plants to where they're searching for light. And so when we talk about the phenomenon of fall stem elongation, what that crop is doing is it's actually stretching and searching for light, and that tends to allow the growing point to extend above the soil surface. And when we talk about winter survival with canola, we really want that growing point to be as close to the soil surface as possible, because that's where it's most protected. If you elevate that growing point to where it's unprotected against the weather elements, then you can have some serious problems with winterkill. So it's a balance of both genetics, selecting the right variety that doesn't show this fall stem elongation problem, then also planting on time, making sure that we don't get that excessive fall growth to potentially induce fall stem elongation.
In the article, you then address whether or not this stem elongation is likely to be an impediment this year, according to your latest observations. And what are your thoughts there?
I'm seeing some of it definitely where the canola was too big going into the winter, you could say. We definitely have that phenomenon going on here in Manhattan because, again, the canola was too big. But, one thing that growers can do if they're concerned about this in their canola is, walk out into their field and pull all that dead, dying leaf tissue away from the crown and just kind of get a feel for whether those crowns are elevated above the soil surface or if they're still flat and prostrate to the soil surface. So that's a good way now just to maybe go out and take a look and see if there's the potential for fall stem elongation to cause some concern for winterkill. If those crowns are dark green, they're still firm when you squeeze them, those plants are definitely alive. But if you're starting to see some whitening of the stem tissue or the crown, or the stem is really squishy when you squeeze it, then you could potentially have some winterkill further down the line.
But you want producers to make that examination closely because they shouldn't give up on a stand too soon.
That's right. And especially this time of year, just driving by on the road, it's going to look dead. All that biomass will die away, and it'll be brown and white, and you just don't see a lot of green out there. But if you walk out into the field and take a look at those crowns, you'll be able to know pretty quickly, how well the crop is doing. We've seen over the years that canola can withstand some stand thinning because it's got this ability to fill in for those gaps in the field. And so some self-thinning and some winterkill, if it's scattered throughout the field and not in big pockets, can actually be okay for the crop because it's going to go ahead and branch out.
Well, looking to the weeks ahead then, if we might, Mike, last week, cold temperatures, several days below freezing all day. This past week, we've had extremely warm temperatures for this time of the year. Is that likely to instigate any problems as we see those temperature swings and the crop thinking it's time to break out of dormancy?
Yeah, it can be a bit of a challenge for the crop because we just don't know what we're going to get for conditions here moving forward. It appears that we're going to be above normal for temperatures, and that's probably a good thing at this point in time. However, you think back to last February, we had that really cold stretch this time of year where we were, I think I looked here recently, we had like 13 nights where we were below 10 and down to almost minus 20 in some places. The crop looked a lot like it does right now last year, and because it was so well hardened, it was able to withstand those bitterly cold temperatures for that extended period of time. Now when we have these fluctuations, you get maybe a little bit of regrowth. The crop may start to move towards the reproductive phase. I really think it's going to take a couple of weeks of these temperatures where we're in the 60s and lows are in the 30s before we're really going to maybe start to see some new regrowth. If we continue to have, 50, 60-degree days, but then lows down into the 20s and teens, that really kind of keeps the crop at bay yet. So it just really kind of depends on how long these either cold or warm stretches are. If the crop does break dormancy, it's okay this time of year. We've seen that before. If it starts to bolt, that gets to be a little bit more of a concern because it appears that after the crop bolts, that's when it really starts to lose a lot of its winter hardiness. That's when we don't need temperatures down in the single digits.
So that's your red flag.
It's kind of the red flag, yeah. We want it to hold on here until kind of that last significant cold passes, whenever that's going to be, and then move into the reproductive phase.
Time will tell. Lastly, just to note, looking at the breeding program that you oversee, continually working toward traits that will avoid winterkill and other adversities, and you're examining semi-dwarf hybrids as a component of that.
Yeah, we've been looking at semi-dwarfs for a number of years now, actually, and they bring a trait that I believe is going to be really useful for our growers in the coming years. We don't have any semi-dwarfs that are currently commercially available, but we do see companies that are working with this trait that do have an interest in our region, and eventually maybe we'll see some of these hybrids come into the market. Semi-dwarfs basically have a very firm, stiff, and compact crown. They tend to not fall stem elongate, and they hold that crown position then throughout the winter months. So, we're doing some of the same things with the selection, the recurrent selection that we're doing in our breeding program by selecting varieties that have that same feature. The semi-dwarf trait is kind of the key, I guess, that you could say that fits the lock that would really benefit our growers here in the Southern Plains. Another benefit of the semi-dwarfs is that they are shorter. That's why we call them a dwarf plant. So we typically could see some benefit to shattering loss when the plants are shorter and stacked against each other more compactly. I'm excited about this trait, and I think it's something that could really benefit our growers down the line.
Looking forward to those developments and bringing those traits into the fold in as far as advancing canola genetics for production here in Kansas and the central region. And we'll watch and wait and see what's happening with canola as we warm up in earnest come springtime, and we'll catch up with you again and get a status report at that time. Mike, thank you for coming over.
You're welcome, Eric. Thank you.
Mike Stamm with us, canola breeder, K-State Research and Extension. And we'll have more for you on Agriculture Today. We're back now on Agriculture Today, and it's time once again for your weekly horticulture segment. As our days are slowly getting longer and the weather more pleasant, very gradually so, those of you with fruit trees in your home landscape or home orchard might want to think toward pruning those trees. Joining us once again is K-State Research and Extension horticulturist Ward Upham with some of the general rules of pruning these. And this is somewhat of a mandatory step as far as fruit tree management, isn't it, Ward?
That's right. And so these are going to be listed in order. So you go through these in order, and you're going to stop when you hit about 30% of the tree. You never take out more than 30% of the tree. There is one exception, which I'll mention later. Mm-hmm. So the first step is to take out any broken, damaged, or diseased limbs. Now, if it's broken or dead, for example, you don't count that as the 30%. If two branches form a narrow angle, in other words, if they're growing really close to one another and that V is really narrow, one of them needs to go. One of them is going to split out if you don't take it out. Also, take out all suckers and water sprouts. Suckers come up from the base of the tree or from the roots. And so they're going to be growth from that area. Those need to come out. Water sprouts come up on the major limbs of the tree and grow straight up. And you mainly see these on like apple trees, especially if you prune them fairly hard. You're going to see both suckers and water sprouts. Those need to come out. Then if you have two branches that cross, one of them has to go. because you don't want that wound to develop. And then cut back or remove branches that are so low they interfere with harvest or pruning. If you cut back a branch, you take it back to the next larger branch or even to the trunk. You do not leave a stub. Now, if there's a collar there, that swollen area where it attaches, you don't cut into the collar. Just take it so it's flush with it. And then you cut back branches to reduce the total size of the tree if necessary. And then you thin the branches on the interior of the tree. Now, when you hit 30%, you stop.
Right.
And so you may not make it through all these steps, but when you hit 30%, you stop. So how much you prune depends on the type of tree that you have.
And break that down. You have these categorized more or less.
That's right. So the first group is those that really don't need much pruning. That's cherry, pear, and plum. If you have any of the problem things, such as narrow branches or trees rubbing, any type of that thing, then you prune them. Other than that, you really don't need to do much to them. The next ones that need pruning are going to be apples and peaches. Apples, if you don't prune them, tend to be overgrown. If you don't prune them, you're going to have a windstorm and an ice storm that'll take them out. It'll just break them apart. And so it's important that you prune them, not only so that they don't break apart in wind and ice storms, but also because they tend to overbear. In other words, you get into what's called biennial bearing. You get a huge fruit load one year and no fruit the next. And so by pruning them well, you can reduce the amount of fruit so that they bear the right amount of fruit every year. Now, you probably still have to do some thinning. You want an apple, for example, about every, maybe 6 inches or so. And that will be enough that the tree will be able to produce fruit every year so that you don't get into that biennial bearing thing.
What specifics are required for peaches then?
Yeah, peaches are different in the sense that they bear fruit on wood that grew the previous season. If you don't prune for several years, if you do get a year when you get fruit, it's going to be borne clear on the ends of the branches. You're going to break the tree apart. Problem with peaches and nectarines is that you don't get fruit every year. You get a late frost and it's going to take it out.
Yeah.
Take the fruit out. Tree's going to be fine. It's important that you prune every year, though, so that when you do get fruit, it's borne closer to the center of the tree so that you don't break the tree apart. And I mentioned that there's an exception to that 30% rule. That's with peaches. I mean, you don't have to take over 30%, but you can. You can take out a third every year if you want to. And so that's one of those trees you really do need to prune, even if it doesn't have any fruit.
Regardless of your expectations on productivity, do think about pruning. That is part of long-term maintenance of all of these fruit trees. And we're now around to the time where you should be thinking about that, home fruit growers, and actually carrying that out as the weather allows. Ward, thank you.
You bet.
That's Ward Upham, horticulturist with K-State Research and Extension, bringing us this week's horticulture segment. Our time's away once more. Thanks for tuning in. Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.